I think one of the most remarkable aspects in politics today is the extent to which we refer to these issues as culture wars. Let's call them what they are. We're talking about women's rights. We're talking about children's welfare. We're talking about how we think about our national history. Many of these things are the foundations of civilization, and we shouldn't be ashamed or bullied into thinking that they are somehow fringe issues that only 5 or 10% of the country think about. And if you vocalize your concerns about them, you're sort of a pariah for doing so, because most of these positions are mainstream issues.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Matthew Goodwin. Matthew, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on this week in particular, given everything that's happening in British politics. So let's jump straight into it. So we have a new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. Boris Johnson seems to have been put back in his box. He didn't quite make the cut in terms of getting enough support from Conservative MPs. Poor old Liz Truss and Trussonomics already seems to be a fading memory. That was an incredibly short-lived political and economic experiment that already seems to be one for the history books. And what a lot of people are saying about the rise of Rishi from the rubble of the past few weeks is that this represents a return to normality, a restoration of adult politics, grown-up politics, competent politics, and we can all now breathe a sigh of relief. I wanted to ask you to begin with, do you accept that narrative, or do you think things might be a little bit more complicated than that?
I think it's very tempting to sort of fall into the narrative of this is a sort of return to a sort of dry managerialism, technocracy. This is about, sort of Westminster SW1, whatever you want to call it, reasserting its control. And what we're going to see is a sort of quick return to the Conservative politics of the 2010s, a sort of George Osborne 2.0. And I was of that view. I think a few months ago, that was my sort of working assumption when it came to Rishi Sunak. I actually think today that I'm going to reserve judgment for a few weeks and months and actually just see what Sunak does when he's confronted with these enormous choices. And the reason for that is, talking to people within and around the Sunak camp, there are those who say, basically this is about competence. This is about, kind of ruthless execution of power, someone with experience. But then there are also quite a few people who say, look, actually, a lot of the stuff that's written about Sunak actually gets him wrong. He is actually quite culturally conservative on a lot of issues. He does kind of understand where this new Conservative electorate is at. He does read the research, the evidence. So I'm pausing judgment just to see what he does in this early honeymoon period.
I think reserving judgment is always a good idea when there's a new Prime Minister, because often what the establishment hopes a new Prime Minister will do and what a new Prime Minister actually does, they can be different things. I think one of the things that concerns me anyway is that you're right that we can't be certain what Rishi Sunak will do in power. It does remain to be seen. But the noise is coming from sections of the establishment that I thought had been slightly pushed aside by the electorate do concern me. So you mentioned there, for example, George Osborne. George Osborne seems to me to have become incredibly outspoken and even quite cocky over the past few weeks. He was on TV the other day saying that the markets have spoken and they've chosen Rishi Sunak. And of course, there are other voices from that pre-Brexit era of Cameroon politics who are feeling quite confident that Rishi Sunak will restore their view of the world and their approach to political life. So leaving aside for a moment the possibility that Rishi Sunak won't do that and that he might do something that will surprise them and surprise other people too, what do you think that aspiration for a return to that kind of pre-2016 political and economic orthodoxy, what does that tell us, do you think, about the old establishment and what their aspirations right now might be?
Well, in a way, I think that's what's so interesting about the reaction to Sunak, because if this push to, sort of return to Osborneomics and the Conservative politics of the 2010s were to succeed, the Conservative Party would be slaughtered at the next general election. And so the constraints that are on the Conservative Party because of the transitions it's gone through in 2016, 17 and 19 mean that actually it can't return to that territory. And if it did, it would literally be completely demolished by Labour and the SNP at the next election. So, the electoral logic that now underpins the Conservative Party means that really, if it wants to hold power and if it wants to do what no other political party in the history of British politics has ever done, which is go on to win a fifth term, then it's going to actually have to be responsive to this new Conservative electorate. So I'm not actually as gloomy as some people are, because I think, the Conservative Party historically has always been ruthlessly focused on maintaining and upholding power. And most people within the parliamentary party, which again has changed a lot since the 2010s, the Red Wallers are a vocal group, the ERG are a vocal group, the Common Sense group are very vocal. They all understand where the party's electorate is at, which is partly why it was so conflicted over Johnson and why it was so, adamant early on that, Truss was a disaster. And I think, Truss, we can come back and talk about her later on. But with Sunak, I just don't think he can return to pre-2016 Conservative politics, because he's not an idiot. I mean, he will know that London, university towns, middle-class professionals, graduates, young Zoomers, he will know that a lot of those groups are off the table 2 years from now. He will know that because of Brexit, because of the anger and the resentment that's built up over 12 years, winning those people back is going to be impossible. Maybe the election after it starts to become possible. But that's why I think, even the sort of most, Osborne-like technocrat kind of Conservative would accept that they're going to have to react and move if they are to survive.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to ask you a bit more about the new electorate and the political realignment, which you've written about at length over the past few years, and in your forthcoming book, which we'll talk about in a moment. But firstly, let's talk then about Boris Johnson and Liz Truss and the problems there. So you wrote this week, or last week, I think, about the idea that Boris Johnson could ride back in to take over the Conservative Party and get back into Downing Street and easily win an election may have been a bit more mythical than some people thought. And that's quite a counterintuitive idea, certainly if you listen to Boris fanboys and fangirls, because the point they make, the correct point they make, is that Boris Johnson got a stonking majority in December 2019. I know we don't have a presidential system, as people keep reminding us, but it does seem fairly obvious to me that lots of people voted for the Tory party because of Boris Johnson, because of what he was saying and because of how he appeared and because of what he seemed to represent. So they say that, which is true, but I think they probably overestimate the idea that Boris Johnson is still popular in the same places he was popular in the past, and that his actions over the past few years haven't had a detrimental impact on his standing in the eyes of the public. So to start with Boris first, what's your view now on why Boris failed over the past few days and the prospects for him coming back at some point in the future? Or do you think the Boris moment has just passed?
Well, I think firstly, one of the arguments that I wrote in my Substack a few days before Johnson basically failed to get to the numbers, which he clearly did fail to get the numbers he wanted. I said, basically, look, there are three arguments against Johnson having a sequel. The first, which a lot of MPs pushed, is that he was just simply incompetent and he just wasn't suited to high office. Personally, I sort of agreed with that. I was much more supportive of what Johnson was trying to do in 2019 because of the political and the constitutional crisis that was rapidly engulfing the country. And I thought, all things considered, because I was, one of the academics who put my head up above the parapet and said, we need to implement Brexit and we need to do it. Yeah. I just felt in that moment, at that time, he was the person that was going to do that. So, the competency point then became increasingly visible as we went through, COVID and also Partygate, and a lack of judgment there as well. I think the second argument, which was also true, is that, Johnson wasn't only incompetent, he just, at certain points, really just had very bad judgment. If you look back at some of the decisions that he made, in office, some of the people he had around him. Like, one of the things I always found fascinating about the Johnson premiership, there were no serious thinkers in the Johnson camp. Like, there was like one or two people maybe, but this was nothing like the sort of Thatcher era or the Blair era or the Brown era. Like, it seemed to me a very sort of lightweight operation. And then the third and most persuasive argument against Johnson, which was made to me by a number of Red Wall MPs, was, look, even if you are like a Johnson fanboy, at the end of the day, you got a really crappy return on your investment, because if you actually look at all the things he did, this was not someone who was sticking to the realignment. Like, this was not somebody who was really going hard, and there were so many people over the last few years who I think were desperately looking at Johnson and just being like, they were projecting onto him, they wanted him to be this figure. But then you look at all the stuff that happened around the online safety bill and net zero, a lot of the progressive stuff, immigration policy, the small boats in the channel, the culture stuff. He just was either absent or was kind of making these decisions that were completely adrift from where his new electorate was. So when I was hearing, MPs who should otherwise be kind of shouting for Johnson from the rooftops, saying, it's not about the competency point, it's about the delivery point. He just didn't deliver what I needed him to deliver in order to hold my seat. That's when I was like, well, this guy's toast. Like, he's not going to get the nominations. He's not going to get the numbers that he needs. And also, I was just struck, like, I think most of us saw Trustful coming like weeks before it did. I think most of us were aware that this premiership was imploding. And Johnson doesn't come back until 2 days before to start drumming up nominations. Like, that to me, again, it's this judgment point. If you think that the epicenter of politics is imploding, you sense a second opportunity, you come back and you do the groundwork. You come back and you set up the team. You start having meetings. You start bringing people together. And the fact that he sort of zoomed in, with 48 hours to go and then didn't get the nominations and then left everybody hanging by saying, well, he's out of the, he's decided to leave the race, was just, classic Johnson. And I agree with some people who have said since that because of how he handled the mechanics of that comeback or that attempted comeback, it almost obliterates his chances of doing so again.
Did you know that learning has been shown to improve our mood? And with the brilliant shows, documentaries and series available on Wondrium, learning doesn't have to be something formal like enrolling in a course or studying. Learning can be something we do on our own terms, and it can be fun. I know I feel great after learning something new, and on Wondrium it is just so easy. For example, I've been listening to The Birth of the Modern Mind, the intellectual history of the 17th and 18th centuries. This 24-part series delves into the heart of the Enlightenment to explore the intellectual revolution that challenged previous ways of understanding and which sparked radical changes in thought and life. Newton, Pascal, Locke, Voltaire, Rousseau, and many more are all featured. You do not want to miss this. And why stop there? Wondrium provides unlimited access to thousands of hours of content covering any topic you can imagine. This includes audio and video courses, documentaries, tutorials, and much more. All of it is presented by top professors and experts, and there is no pressure of homework or grades. I know you will benefit from Wondrium too, and I want you to sign up today. Wondrium is offering my listeners a free month of unlimited access. To get this offer, you need to visit my special URL, wondrium.com/Brendan. That's wondrium.com/Brendan. I think that's a very apt description of the Boris era across the board, in fact. And I think one of the things I find frustrating about the focus on competence, of course, we all want competent politicians. We all want politicians who know what they're doing. And it is correct that Boris was very often incompetent and made bad judgments and behaved in an unprofessional manner. But I think one of the things that's frustrating about that, it overlooks his greater crime, one might say, which is that he didn't have much substance and he didn't adhere to some of the ideas and some of the aspirations that were invested in him by the realigned electorate, and particularly on the culture war front, where I think he was completely lacking. He backed out. He was continually accused by newspapers like The Guardian of fighting a culture war. And I remember reading those pieces thinking, if only that were true, if only he were raising some of these issues, but he's not, and he certainly didn't do it very well.
But just briefly on that, I think the other point about Johnson that very few people appreciated during his premiership, he is genuinely cosmopolitan in many respects. Like the Trump comparison was just very, very off and misleading. Instinctively, Johnson is basically liberal. I mean, he is somebody who comes from a very, very particular bohemian cosmopolitan family background.
Yeah.
And he, I think for that reason, just wanted to be seen by many other liberals as somebody who was nice and was not toxic. And he was, I think, too preoccupied with how he was seen than remaining connected with the people who had actually put him into power. And I think that was also a dynamic of his premiership that ended up really undermining what he was about and what he was trying to do.
Yeah, and it was such a great shame. I remember the day after the election in December 2019 when Boris thanked the working classes for lending them his votes and openly recognized that this was not a normal thing for them to do. And then to squander that and to sink back into his fairly typical bohemian, supposedly liberal politics, as you outline it there, I think was just a bit of a betrayal. And lots of people will have felt that quite strongly. Before we get on to what that squandering means for the realignment in British political life, let's just talk about Liz Truss. So I flit between feeling sympathy for Liz Truss because I'm sure she feels incredibly humiliated and she's the shortest ever serving prime minister in the country, and all of her Thatcherite aspirations and performances came to naught in the end. But the other part of me thinks, well, what did she expect? If you are going to bring in a free market style economic approach, one that is influenced by the IEA, and I should say that I like the IEA. I think they've got some good people there, but no one ever voted for them. Then I think it does indicate a misunderstanding of where the electorate is at in relation to issues around the market, about public spending, about the importance of government assistance for communities and the agenda of levelling up. So was Truss's mistake simply that she misunderstood where the electorate is at, and particularly where people who voted for the Tories in 2019, what their thinking is as well?
I think to me, Truss is just so fascinating as a character and as a short chapter in the history of British politics, because I still feel like I'm sort of in shock just trying to process what happened to that premiership. But we always knew that there was a strain within the Conservative Party that looked a lot like the Truss premiership. We always knew it. We talked about it. It was exaggerated by certain sections of the media. It was, often portrayed as being much bigger than it was. It was only ever a fringe part of the Conservative Party. And then when she came in with the mini budget and everything else, I just thought, wow, okay, this is really happening. And I think probably what struck me really the most during that time was just the sort of complete and utter disconnection from the people that are voting for the Conservative Party. Like if you look at the post-2019 Conservative electorate, and I've been doing this week for a paper I'm writing, we've tried to identify how big the kind of Truss group is within the Conservative electorate, like people that are basically pro-tax cuts, are comfortable with high migration, are pro-globalization, the kind of Davos-on-Thames liberal leaver vision of Brexit. And I'm telling you, we have to relax things to the definition of that just to get it up to 10%. Like it is so fringe within the Conservative Party. And if you were to take a view of Truss as being libertarian, and I don't think Truss is libertarian, many of my libertarian friends have been in touch this week with me to to explain why they don't think she's libertarian and so on. But let's just say there is a perception that she was libertarian. One of the remarkable things is there are more of those voters in the Lib Dems than there are in the Conservative Party, right? And that's one of the fascinating points about British politics. So she was completely disconnected from the people that were voting for a party. The way in which they sort of naively underestimated the market reaction was just astounding. The lack of preparation going into that premiership, like if you go back and remember the polls, she knew she was going to be PM in July. Like, she knew the lead was so big against Sunak. She knew that she was going to be prime minister. And yet there was no attempt to frame her premiership. There was no attempt to explain what the problems in the country were and why she was introducing this new economic orthodoxy. There was seemingly no attempt to take as many MPs along with her as possible. The death of the Queen was obviously an unfortunate beginning to the premiership, but she fumbled that. She was the only prime minister in history, not in our recorded history, not to have a bounce in the opinion polls, which I also thought was a telling sign. And basically within 6 weeks, she basically knocked off 15 points from the Conservative vote. I mean, it was just utterly remarkable. I mean, she basically did 2 or 3 times as much damage as Partygate did, right? If you looked at it in terms of the polling hit. So I'm still trying to process exactly how all of that happened and so on. And it's now, Sunak's job to pick it up and run with it. But the blunt reality, the impact and legacy of all that is nobody who is associated with that doctrine, or nobody who is associated rightly or wrongly with libertarian conservatism or the Davos-on-Thames vision of Brexit will ever be let anywhere near power for the rest of our lifetimes. And in some ways, I think in some ways that is positive, that the Davos-on-Thames vision is dead, because that was never what Brexit was all about. 80-90% of Brexit voters really did not share that vision of what Brexit was about. And if actually the farce of the last 6 weeks is what is required to finally kill that off, then maybe it was needed. Maybe now we can actually get back to this much more interesting, timely, salient discussion about, okay, we now have a left and right that are at least publicly committed to this new Brexit model. What's it going to look like? How are we going to deliver it? How are we going to navigate these multiple crises and try and get the country into a more interesting place? And maybe Truss just, locked off that other option and that other opportunity, and has just helped us have a sense of clarity and a sense of vision, a sense of what this moment is really all about.
Yeah, I could not agree more with your description of their misunderstanding of Brexit. And the frustrating experience I've had over the past 6 years is that when I speak to right-leaning people in media circles in London, they tend to see Brexit as you describe it, Davos on the Thames, or Singapore on the Thames, as some of them say, as just a green light for free market insanity. But when I've gone around the country and done talks and met other people who voted for Brexit, it's completely different. They saw Brexit as an opportunity to restore sovereignty, of course, to restore their own democratic clout, and to create a new system of governance that would take them seriously and have a positive impact on their communities and on their own lives. So the difference between the interpretations of Brexit was always extraordinary. And I like your optimistic take that maybe it takes the disaster of the Truss 6-week or 2-month premiership to make people realize that Brexit was not just about free market stuff.
If you're a regular listener to this show or a regular reader of Spiked, why not become a Spiked supporter? Spiked supporters is our thriving community of people who donate to Spiked. Anyone who gives £5 or more a month or £50 or more a year can become a Spiked supporter and get access to lots of exciting perks. Spiked supporters can comment on articles, get free and discounted tickets to events, get a discount on all items in our shop, and bookmark articles as you browse. This is our way of saying thank you to all of you who fund our work. Spiked is completely free, and yet you still hand over your hard-earned cash to make sure that anyone, anywhere can read us and listen to us. We're incredibly grateful for your generosity. If you don't give to Spiked yet, now is the perfect time to start. Just go to spiked-online.com/supporters to set up your donation and your Spiked supporters account. That's spiked-online.com/supporters.
I should say for listeners, if you can hear lots of fireworks and explosions, it's because I live in a very nice part of London that has a large Indian heritage community, and they're celebrating Diwali. Let's talk about what underlies all of this, which is the realignment, which you've already already referred to. It's something that you've written about at great length over the past few years. You write about it in your book that will be published next year, Values, Voice and Virtue, The New British Politics. And you talk about how there is a new alliance of voters, which is not the old left versus right kind of voting. There's something new going on in terms of how people think when they go to the ballot box, and what's happened with the way in which working class voters in particular think of themselves and who they're willing to lend their vote to. So to just kick off this part of the discussion, just describe to me how you understand the political realignment and why you think it's important.
Yeah, so realignments really refer to the rise of a new political party or a set of ideas that dominate the agenda for a significant period of time, and they tend to change the established coalitions. They tend to lead to the rise of new electorates, like what we saw with Johnson in 2019 and what I think we've seen since the Brexit referendum. So we've been in this sort of unfolding post-Brexit realignment, which has also really been reflected in global trends. So we can see similar shifts in America, the Republicans becoming very successful among working class non-graduates, also working class Hispanic Latino voters. We can see it in the recent results in Sweden. We can see it in France and elsewhere. So many similar shifts are happening in other countries, which should give us reason, by the way, to be skeptical in Britain of the argument that, well, maybe 2019 was unique. Maybe it was, Brexit and Corbyn and they're not factors anymore. Well, that actually doesn't explain why these things are still swirling around other Western democracies. And basically what I think has happened, and what I think the evidence shows quite clearly, is that we now have a very large number of voters who basically no longer feel that their values are reflected in the established political class. They no longer feel that they have a voice, not just within those parties, but across the prevailing culture within media, education, creative institutions, and are increasingly being looked down upon by people within those institutions, not because of any acceptable, legitimate reason, but often simply because of who they are, because they have the wrong educational background or because they have the wrong fixed identity. And as a consequence, what we've been seeing are these cross-cutting issues basically tearing off voters from left-wing parties, right-wing parties, and they've been changing sides. And if you look at what we can see in Britain, even now today, yes, the Conservatives are collapsing in the polls, but one of the reasons for that, by the way, is not because the vast majority have switched to Labour. About 15 to 20% have switched to Labour over the last 2 weeks, and that's just because it's become such a political catastrophe, the kind of state of the country. The vast majority of disillusioned voters on the right, who often previously had voted for Nigel Farage or had voted for Brexit, maybe hadn't voted at all, are now saying actually they're not going to vote for anybody. They're just going to sit politics out. They've had a go. They tried to reshape the system, and they're just going to sit it out. And so the big winner in all of this, I think, is going to be apathy. And so all realignments are about demand and supply. Now, if the demand is there and you supply it with an appealing message, like the Republicans are doing at the moment, as they go into the midterms, they're talking about crime, they're talking about inflation, and they're talking about woke issues in schools and universities. Those are the top three issues across all Republican ads at the midterms, as a study has just shown. If you look at Britain and you look at the demand for a similar type of realignment, there is no supply. Truss supplied it terribly. She gave people the wrong formula, the wrong policies. Johnson really failed to build on what he did in 2019. Sunak, the jury's out. Let's see how he tries to meet that demand with his own particular formula. But the point that is very clear is that because of these long-term demographic and cultural divides that are opening up across Western democracies, there is now ample potential for new parties and existing parties to tap into this and to mobilize these very distinctive coalitions.
Yeah, and I think your description of apathy potentially being the victor of some of this stuff is very true. I know that people from the area of London that I come from, lots of them felt incredibly enthusiastic about voting for Brexit in 2016 and for voting for Boris Johnson in 2019, having previously spent many elections saying, they're all the same, I don't care, I'm not voting for anyone. And the thing that concerns me now is that lots of people will go back to that pre-2016 approach of thinking, what's the point of voting? It won't make any change. You'll end up with the same people in power anyway. But in relation to that, I wanted to ask you in particular about Labour. You mentioned Labour there, and Labour does seem to be benefiting to a certain extent from the chaos of the Tory party. Keir Starmer is rising in the polls. But that is a bit of an illusion, isn't it? Because it does seem that Labour is still as culturally and politically disconnected from its traditional voter base as it has been for a few years now. Labour, under Starmer, when he was the Brexit shadow minister, notoriously proposed the second referendum policy, which will have annoyed many, many voters. Also, we've just seen this week that Keir Starmer is unwilling to say whether Eddie Izzard would be on an all-women shortlist. And I don't want to pick on Eddie Izzard. I'm sure he's a very nice guy and he might even make a good MP. But aren't those kinds of things where you have a Labour Party that doesn't understand Brexit, actually wants to overthrow Brexit, and also doesn't understand the importance of these cultural issues? That's a party that's not going to connect with working class voters, isn't it?
Well, the first thing to say about Labour, compared to where they were 2 years ago, they're in a stronger position and they are seeing levels of support in the polls currently that they've not seen since the mid to late 1990s ahead of Tony Blair's victory. And they've done a few things that I do think are significant. Their positioning on Brexit, whether genuine or not, is an improvement on where they were in 2019. The narrative and discussion around British jobs, British workers, some of the stuff around manufacturing is basically where I think they would want to be. They've not yet gone near issues such as crime, which I suspect Starmer will start to talk a lot more about. He's tried to say some things on immigration, but has not really been able to go too far. But I think overall they're in a better position politically, strategically than they were certainly in 2019, and the local election results would certainly bear that out. But I still think that Labour remain deeply vulnerable on in a number of areas. I think one, all the cultural questions that you've just referenced. So if you look at all the issues around women's rights, identity politics, language, the sort of enforcement of speech codes, political correctness, whatever you want to call it. These are basically fringe positions among progressive activists that are usually supported by somewhere between 5 and 15% max of the country. If you were to give people a question like, we should refer to women as pregnant persons, that's like a 5% position. 80% of people out there in the country will say this is insane. A woman is a woman. This is not a kind of complicated discussion in most places in the country. So the cultural questions are certainly ones where Labour is vulnerable, much like you can see in the US, the Democrats are vulnerable on those questions too. But I also still am not quite convinced, actually, that Labour's got into the place it needs to be on economic management and on managing the economy and being trusted with the economy. Everything in politics is relative, and in some ways the Conservatives have shot themselves in their own foot by removing their reputation of fiscal credibility during the Truss experiment. But Labour, I still think, are quite vulnerable, and Starmer's leadership ratings are still actually quite flat. I mean, one of the interesting comparisons with the 90s is while Labour as a party are polling similar levels of support, Starmer's own ratings are about 20 to 30 points below where Tony Blair's were at the same point in the cycle. So there is still a problem with Starmer and how he connects. Now, with someone who is perhaps a bit more of a savvy campaigner, maybe a Sunak, maybe Johnson comes back for the campaign, who knows? But with the Conservatives unloading on Starmer, pointing out some of the inconsistencies in his position, will he become more vulnerable? Perhaps the front bench, Labour's front bench, I think, is still actually quite weak. I think probably they want to be thinking about ways of changing that up and trying to make it more interesting. But they've also, lastly, I think, got a problem around electoral geography in that Labour still has not won the popular vote in non-London England since 2001. So yes, it's making lots of progress, but actually once you go outside of the university towns and the big cities where Labour votes are stacked very high, there is still a problem there with Labour. And the frustrating part for Conservatives, I suspect, is, they had everything to play for in not only holding that territory, but expanding that territory. This is one of the points Johnson's team completely lost sight of. There's still about 36 red wall seats that are in Labour hands with very, very small Labour majorities. So even if they got smashed in parts of the blue wall, there was territory that they could have leaned into to offset those losses. But that was something that, again, Johnson and his team lost sight of. So I think it's a case of what base. Of course, the cultural questions really matter, but the reality is we are going into an election campaign that is going to be a rerun of 2015. It is going to be dominated by public spending cuts and taxes. Taxes are going to go up for everybody, and public spending cuts are going to be taking place across the board. And that will be the next 2 years of British politics.
Matthew, my final question for you, which follows on from what you've just said and slightly puts you on the spot. And I say it while recognizing that this is not a zero-sum game. But on that question of culture war versus the economy and what is more important, it's a problematic question in a sense, because obviously the economy is incredibly important right now, especially in the energy crisis. People's bills are going up. People are unsure how to keep their houses warm and keep food on the table. But there is a tendency, I feel, in sections of the commentariat to use those economic crises to downplay the importance of the cultural conflict. And I wanted to ask you, just to end with, what do you think the Conservative Party and other parties, potentially even new parties, if such a thing were to emerge, what should they focus on? They obviously need to have a positive economic agenda, but they can't afford to forget those cultural tensions, can they?
No, I mean, I think if you look at the US at the moment, which is a useful comparison, what you've seen there is obviously the surge to dominance of economic questions about inflation, jobs, cost of living. But what you've also seen are individuals, movements, activist parties that have been keeping the salience of cultural issues as high as possible, largely for electoral reasons, to try and divide the Democrats. And that's been especially the case when it comes to schooling and teaching and, sort of gender identity, ideology and all of that sort of stuff. And that's been a really kind of supply side led change in American politics, whereby these cultural questions have really stayed right at the top of the agenda, especially for Republicans, and have more recently been joined by concerns over the border on the southern border. Now, if you look at Britain, I do a lot of polling, and if you look at how people feel about small boats in the Channel, how they feel about current levels of migration, if you said to them, look, okay, it's not a salient issue for voters, but if you said to them, do you think the government should conduct a review into what kids are being taught on race, sex and gender, 75 to 80% of parents will say, yep, I think that's a good idea. Let's just see what's happening. Lots of these issues, do you think we should take on the European Convention? And if it means we can have a more robust response when it comes to controlling the borders and defending Britain from smuggling gangs and so on and so forth. These are all, really supported. But of course, what we tend to do is we tend to look at the list of the most salient questions and we say, well, economy is number one, cost of living number two, and the environment's number three. Therefore, everything else doesn't matter. And actually, voters don't think like that. I mean, voters are looking in a way to be kind of activated and be drawn into discussions and debates that resonate with their daily lives. And there are lots of people today who still feel very strongly that the cultural axis of politics is as important to them, if not more important, than some of the economic questions that we're describing. I mean, for example, I think one of the most remarkable aspects in politics today is the extent to which we refer to these issues as culture wars. Like, to me, this is one of the biggest examples of how Conservatives have ceded territory on a whole array of questions around children's welfare, women's rights, history, national identity. And, it's not just Conservatives, but people who care about those issues have essentially allowed them to be wrapped up and relabeled as culture wars and to be considered beyond the pale, or to be considered, polarizing or toxic. And to me, that's just one of the biggest political own goals that we've seen over the last 20, 30 years, which is why I don't like using that language. I think, if you're referring to some of these debates, let's call them what they are. We're talking about women's rights. We're talking about children's welfare. We're talking about how we think about our national history. Many of these things are the foundations of civilization, and we shouldn't be ashamed or scared or bullied into thinking that they are somehow fringe issues that only 5 or 10% of the country think about. And if you vocalize your concerns about them, you're sort of a pariah for doing so. Because, as I say, once you step outside of the 15%, who also tend to wield disproportionate levels of influence within institutions, most of these positions are mainstream issues. Like, most people out there think we should teach as much of the good in British history as the bad. Most people out there are pretty nuanced in how they view the effects of migration. They're not sort of fanatical in saying it's all good and it's all positive. Most people accept that globalization has had negative impacts on working class communities, and they sort of don't share the kind of religious tone that economists share when they talk about these questions, and I think that that's why partly we've seen these political revolts over the last 10 years, and we've seen the tremors and the earthquakes that have swept through British politics, because people have begun to just call out a lot of these narratives and have begun to mobilize politically to try and make those views known. And I suspect they'll continue to do so in different forms, regardless of what happens with the Sunak premiership and regardless of what happens at the next general election.
Matthew Goodwin, thank you very much.
Thank you.